you to LDO and the US Embassy for inviting me, and thank you to the audience for being here listening and asking questions. I'm honored to be part of this panel, and John, Christina, and Jamea, I just feel privileged to hear your perspectives on this. So, my title is Gender-Based Hate Speech, a Threat to Democracy, and you can see I don't have a question mark after that one. So, I'll start. If you don't stop blogging, I'll smash your parents' faces. She sits by the window in the corner of a spacious bar in Oslo a Thursday night in December. She's been blogging since she was a teenager, and now she's in her early 20s. I asked her for an interview since she's a well-known advocate against online bullying. She begins the interview by stating that she really hasn't experienced that much online harassment. She says, not in comparison to what many others get. And this was what everyone told me. She has only received a death threat once, which was nonsense, she says. I did not take that seriously. She goes on by stating, only a few people receive extreme hatred, but everyone experiences being harassed on the internet, even if you're 10 years old. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, nations shall specifically protect their citizens' right to freedom of opinion and expression as, I quote, the right to hold opinions without interference, and the right to freedom of expression, which shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally in writing or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of choice. In 2004, I did a 6-month-long fieldwork in Tehran to investigate the role that feminist magazines played when it comes to expanding what was acceptable to write and speak about in the public sphere of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The year before, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression visited Iran and noted that many of the people he met during his mission told him that in Iran, I quote, there is freedom of expression, but there is no freedom after expression. He describes it as a climate of fear. In an interview with the editor of the most prominent Iranian feminist magazine at the time, they had 8, in Norway we have 1, she explains how, for the journalists of the third world, it's a practice of art to know where you can say things, when you can say, and to whom you are saying it. The sanctions aimed at those that challenge what Iranians call the red line varies from simple warnings to prosecution, harassment, imprisonment, torture, and for some, kidnapping and murder. It was not until the terrorist attack in Oslo and Utøya in 2011 that I began to link the experiences of the feminists in Iran with those of people with political opinions in Norway. The silencing of more than 60 young voices on July 22nd was connected to a strong anti-feminist message in the terrorist manifesto. The horror of it has been difficult for many Norwegians, including myself, to even comprehend. And 2 years later, a Swedish documentary was aired on television, followed by a Norwegian counterpart, both showing the nature and the extent of gendered online harassment against female journalists and activists. The debate that followed made it obvious that more data was needed to inform a discussion that, like John said earlier, often trivialized the experience of those being harassed. So with the research project, Online Hatred and Journalist Freedom of Speech, that resulted in the book that Ronald, this is Ronald's copy, The Courage of Opinion, I got the opportunity to meet reporters, editors, bloggers, and others that has been engaged in social debate and as a consequence experienced online harassment. Through an extended survey and a number of in-depth interviews, we got to investigate the phenomenon among all organized journalists and editors in Norway of both genders. It hit me in the stomach when they in interviews told me their stories, and reading the descriptions in the open fields of the survey, stories about fear, discomfort, anger, and loneliness. Like the experienced journalist who told me that threats of rape became her own private problem when her boss gave a clear message that she could not do anything about it. She says, "I was put off. I did not talk about it to anybody at work," she says. "I could have had a completely different attitude to sharing experiences today if I did not get such a cold shower at the time." Hate speech directed against journalists and activists in Norway is not a new phenomenon. With the development of an internet audience, we now get insight into the harassment that previously came directly to the individual in a letter, in the mailbox, or over the landline. Today, commentary sections in digital newspapers and social media make this harassment visible for all and easier to spread to many. What was previously concerned as a private problem of many journalists and editors is now emerging as an important social issue related to freedom of expression. Judith Butler writes about speech injuries, ytringsskader, I call it in Norwegian, that when being exposed to hate speech, the receiver suffers a loss of context. It is the unexpected quality of the action that is so effective. One is being put in one's place. The problem is that such a place can be no place. If Butler is right that this puts one in a position where you lose grip over your own context, and this loss of understanding persists because people around you does not react in a similar way, with shock, consternation, or empathy, then these experiences need to be taken seriously. This non-place where both professional journalists and non-professional bloggers or columnists experience being invaded, harassed, and not taken seriously by their surroundings, it is a place for silence, secrecy, and sometimes even shame. Those I interviewed all talk about the first time they experienced being harassed. For some, it was really serious, with obvious death and rape threats. For others, it is milder forms of harassment that is described. Harassment focusing on their appearance, age, or profession. The first time, the commentary section was, I was blown away and completely broken down because it was so hateful. It was not about the story I wrote. The comments stated that I'm evil and ugly. I had never been spoken to like that before. You start to doubt yourself. I decided then and there I'll never write for the newspaper anymore. She phoned them and asked them to close the commentary section. But then her editor published a comment in the open section that said, "This journalist has written one of the best comments in our online newspaper history. I see that people just do not understand this." She gives me a big smile. Then, for me, the problem was solved. "Did you feel vindicated?" I asked. "Yes, it was a vindication," she says. "Today I would have laughed at it, but at the time, the online harassment was new to me." For many, the first time is a mixed experience, of response being positive in the beginning, before it degenerates and becomes strange. When compliments turn into testing or aggressive stalking, or even threats of violence and rape. Common to them all is that they describe it as a shock, something they were not prepared for, feeling lonely, and how their reactions afterwards was dependent on how others around them handled the situation. If they were ridiculed, ignored, left to themselves, or if managers, editors, or the organization took on responsibility, this seems to be a crucial factor for how later episodes of harassment is experienced and handled by the journalists, and whether this is something they tell others if it happens again and again and again. The first time, I was participating in a debate on NRK, the state channel. Afterwards, everyone went out and had dinner. She was young, in her early 20s, and spoke about feminism on national television. The phone rang constantly, she says. The first few times I answered, but it was a lot of groaning and that type of thing, so I stopped answering the phone and just lay there and lit up again and again. Then I remember one of the other debaters commented, "You're lucky to get so much response. It's only my mom who's been calling me." And then he looked somehow envious into my luminous phone that I completely freaked about. And these calls continued all night. She was utterly confused, she tells me. But was it scary? I ask. It was a shock. Like, what happened now? And you get in place like mechanisms for protection at once. You cannot sit and answer your phone all night. Many years afterwards, I've had trouble answering the phone late at night, if I don't know who's calling. It is very impractical, of course. So it's still a strong feeling? Yes. The phone anxiety was there for a long time. I'm still very selective in terms of what kind of response I answer to. If it's directed at my person, I try to avoid it, she says. For many, the first time is not actually the first time they receive such harassment. Rather, it is the first time they were shaken enough to reflect on whether it's worth to continue writing or speaking out their opinions. Many report that the experience is characterized by irritation, discomfort, or anger rather than fear. The absurdity takes a strong place in these stories. But when does it turn into a mental or physical health issue? When do you lose your courage of opinion? To get to that, we first need a brief look at the numbers. So in our study, about 1,200 Norwegian journalists and editors replied, and close to half of them reported having experienced harassment, threats, or violence in the past 5 years. So that's almost 50%. It's about an equal share of female and male journalists who have received general online harassment, respectively 46% and 47%. And there's also no gender differences in how often journalists have experienced receiving harassment or threats. Threats are somewhat less extensive, but still quite common, as 1 in 4 journalists respond affirmatively that they have experienced threats during the same time. And here slightly more men than female report threats. Almost twice as many young female journalists in the age of 26 to 35 years report harassment compared to their male colleagues of the same age. And when we look at senior journalists, the pendulum turns completely. It is also evident from the survey results that male journalists, to a larger extent than women, experience physical confrontational events, while women receive more comments on body and obscene phone calls. So there are, as we suspected, qualitative differences here, and it's really, really important to break this down. The sexual and gendered harassment is less widespread. In our study, 14% of journalists say they have been subjected to this. But there is a big difference between male and female journalists here. Approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 20 men in the media business have received sexual harassment. That is 25% of female journalists and 5% of male journalists. And then the last number, 1/5, 20% of Norwegian journalists and editors say they feel silenced in Norwegian kneblet because of harassment or threats. 20%. So, when does online harassment go from being an emotional stress or a health problem to be what Butler calls a speech injury? For many journalists, it would be an admission of failure to say, yes, harassment and threats affect me. They are supposed to endure this. They are not seeing themselves as victims, and in the interviews, they always underline the power that the position as journalists installed them with. To get around this professional bias, we ask them instead whether they have become depressed, tired, inattentive, lost their night's sleep, had strong feelings of shame or guilt, or are struggling with anxiety-related symptoms associated with a job as a journalist in the aftermath of online harassment. This gives us more specific knowledge about the consequences of online harassment and hate speech, both for the individual, the profession, and for society in general. So in an article that we published this fall, my colleague Ida Drange and I call this emotional strain, and we connected to a series of questions on personal reactions. We find constantly that getting comments on your body, stalking like inquiries that first is nice to then become unpleasant, and inquiries to ridicule and belittle you all contribute to increased emotional strain. If the journalist that experienced emotional strain also reports having modified their journalistic practice by changing the angle of a story or softening an opinion, then we argue it is possible to determine whether they suffer from what Butler calls speech injuries. The gender debate about the phenomenon may have led to analytical binders not to look for men's experiences of harassment and intimidation. We have therefore examined the context in which journalists react to hate speech by moderating their utterances, and how gender is optionally a factor here. As an editor says, it is not objective, it is extremely subjective. The feeling of discomfort is extremely subjective. She therefore, as a principal, reports all threats directed at her employees to the police if they themselves feel it's serious, regardless of her own perception of severity. So who suffers from speech injuries? What we found is that there are no gender differences between the journalists when it comes to general harassment, but there is a gender difference when it comes to sexual harassment. Women change to a lesser extent than men their journalistic practice as a result of sexual harassment. Men who have experienced sexual or gendered harassment or threats have significantly higher probability of modifying their journalistic practice by changing their stories' angles or softening their opinions. The same does not apply to women. And why? Judith Butler's theory about the shock following hate speech, where the effect is that the receiver loses his or her footing, might help us here. Harassment or threats puts one in a position where you lose grip on the situation, where the unexpected part of the response is what has the negative effect. That it is unthinkable for most male journalists to connect the threats and harassment they receive to their own gender corresponds with Simone de Beauvoir, her theories of the second sex, where she argues for how women in most contexts are interpreted into a gender framework, while men are perceived and perceive themselves as neutral. Women's past experiences with sexual harassment in other arenas in life, at work, in bars, or in the streets, may paradoxically create the expectation that this could happen again, which can soften the shock, enhance the awareness of the consequences of vulnerability and shame, and ultimately lead to the failing of the hate speaker's strategy to silence diverging opinions. Speech injuries are especially potent when one doesn't expect to be humiliated in ways that is connected to gender, sexuality, ethnicity, or race. The first time, I was totally unprepared. I'd written an ordinary story from Senegal. When I got home and opened the email, it said, "Have you been to Africa and got yourself some Negro cock now?" She falls silent. It's 15 years ago, and I did not have my guard up. The email was not close to me physically, like that envelope with pubic hair that I got in my mailbox a few years earlier. It was near in a different way. She describes it as consistent, that the sexual harassment is experienced as getting close to you, regardless of physical distance. When I ask her if she told her editor about this, she stops, struggles with emotion, and I wait for a few seconds, give her time to compose. She says, "If I was to show these messages to my editor, I don't want to cry when at work. I am, after all, a professional." Harassment and threats and violence have consequences for journalistic practice. Journalists who have experienced this are significantly more likely to state that they change the angle of the stories or their opinions to avoid such attention. Journalists who report that they are emotionally strained are also more likely to do this. So what does these findings tell us? They tell us that we should stop blaming women or other minority groups for not enduring or for exaggerating when they tell us stories about sexual or gendered harassment and the consequences of it. The findings tell us that this is a gendered problem in ways that include both men and women. It does not tell us, however, that all women are courageous and a minority of men are just not strong enough. It tells us that what we hear from the personal stories is confirmed by numbers, that the shock and loss of context and shame is psychological effects that we have to take seriously. Precisely because they silence people, even those that are not usually recognized as vulnerable Norwegian journalists. It tells us that those that are vulnerable in terms of minority backgrounds of any sort needs to be paid special attention to. So how can we help prevent speech injuries? We find that to report harassment or intimidation to the police reduces the likelihood of changing or modifying your journalistic practice. This may for many be a form of action-oriented counter-strategy, which in the same way as being open about harassment or threats can remedy speech injuries. However, only 1 out of 10 Norwegian journalists report that they have gone to the police with such incidents the past 5 years. The majority of these reports never lead to prosecution. So the law is not the main problem, but the lack of implementation is. So to close, the first time it happens, shock, humiliation, despair, cascades of harassment, threats, who enters voluntarily into this landscape? Who comes out of it untouched? Judith Butler writes about hate speech that it seeks to ensnare us in a moment of humiliation. Keep us there, stuck, never let go. Many describes it as desperate, dire, and humiliating. At the same time, they says, there are strategies, ways to stand in it, to stand it. But solutions that work for one does not work for others. It is situational how it feels to be met with harassment and threats. And the impact it will have on you as a human being is also sensitive to context. Who you have around you and how they support you is crucial to whether you continue voicing your opinion or telling the stories you think the world needs to hear. Freedom of expression in a society is never more than the individual's experience of being free to express their opinion. One journalist wrote in the survey, "This is something we're going to see more of in the future. Where is the limit of what we must endure?" In an authoritarian regime like Iran, sanctions after crossing what they call the red line range from harassment, closure of publications, to, as I said, imprisonment, torture, and murder. Norway and the US are democracies, and Iran is not. Still, the picture is not black and white. We have freedom of expression, but online we do not yet have freedom after expression. And online communities are just as big a part of our nations and our worlds as the offline world. We need to start taking that seriously and move on from the immature stadium we are in now. Let's become responsible digital communities. And I suggest we start on 4 different levels at the same time. 1, the psychological level. We need more what one journalist called online angels, people that actually give you positive feedback, to take away the shame that both genders feel and actively reduce speech injuries by supporting each other instead of distrusting people's experiences. Second level, the workplace. To many, this is also a labor issue. And as both Jemaya and Christine has told us, a lot of women journalists lose their income because they cannot be online. And a lot of men actually gain income on harassing. Managers are failing today. They need to take on responsibility. They need to report to the police and build support systems. We will look back at this period and shake our heads in disbelief, just as we do now on the fact that sexual harassment in the workplace or rape in marriage were not condoned or forbidden some decades ago. So third, the societal level. Who makes social norms in new spaces? The police, politicians, law enforcement, teachers, and the general public, among others. We all have responsibility here. And how can harassers be brought to justice and helped, or helped not to follow instincts or destructive group thinking? For the technical level, tech companies innovate rapidly, but they need some pressure to not just treat people in their online communities as products, like Jamia told us. And we know from the study that Christina referred to that providing reasonable justification for blocking harassers actually give better behavior in the long run. And the study that we did shows that conspiracy theories dominate among harassers before racism and anti-feminism. Ridiculing them does not help. More intelligent moderation will help. Hate speech is a threat to personal well-being, professional standards of independent journalism, and to democracy if we let it persist. The person that receives the harassment or threats is not the one to solve this fundamental issue of our digital era. Like the blogger in the beginning of my talk stated, only a few people receive extreme hatred, but everyone experiences being harassed on the internet. This is not about individual responsibility, and there is not one solution to it. If we act on this now, hate speech may in the future cease to be a threat to democracy, but we need to act on it together. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. I have a new microphone now, so maybe more people have questions to ask. Okay.
Thank you. Suzanne from the Norwegian Organization for LGBT People with an Immigrant Background. I just have a question. When you say that you need to break it down, have you also broken it down to at more intersectional levels?
Yes.
As in terms of migrants, people with disabilities, gender non-conforming people also, to see how they are faced by this? The first question. The second question, of the 1,200 journalists, do you also have the background?
Yeah.
Do you see any differences between the type of what they are faced with?
It's a very good question, and so this study the survey was aimed at journalists and editors in Norway, and I think there was 5% of them that said they were openly homosexual, for example, and we have also minority background on them, but the numbers are so small that it's difficult for us to make substantial claims on the relation between that kind of background. So that's why gender, of course, is so much easier to use when you analyze this data. Regarding what I talked about speech injuries and who are moderating, we could not find any relation between sexual background or minority background when it comes to being silenced. So that's all we know for now. And I really want to stress that this is one minor study, and we need so much more data to understand this. And what you are asking for is not yet here. So anyone that can give funding to people that want to study that, yes.
Any other questions? I was actually going to ask you, oh wait, just remind me that it's about research and the need for research.
Thank you for that. I thought it was really interesting. I've just done a research project myself on issues related to revenge pornography, and I thought there's quite a lot of things in common with what you were talking about in terms of silencing, and for example how revenge pornography can silence women in terms of expressing themselves as sexual beings. I know there's a lot of people who argue that anonymity online is a serious issue for women who want to express themselves. But then also there's people who say that obviously if you remove anonymity, then you have an issue in terms of freedom of speech. So I was wondering whether you have any ideas or have thought about whether maybe somehow restricting anonymity online might be a way of solving some of the issues or concerns that you've been talking about.
If I understand the question, anonymity on behalf of the commenters, like people that harass?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I think my stand on this is that what we do know now is that anonymity or lack of anonymity does not make a difference. Like harassers harass under full names. So, and I think the anonymity online is important to the journalistic profession. That it should be possible to actually write something anonymous, because that's important to secure some diversion of opinions in our society. But I think it's a difficult question. I just know that it doesn't really change the climate that much.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to comment on the anonymity point, because it's very interesting that that you find that with your data, because in our core has very often come, in our core is the leading television channel here in Norway, and they have often come to speak at our events. And one of the things that the moderator, the one that was like ahead of the moderating, one of the things that he would say was that the requirements of full name for them made a big difference, and that it allowed that the commenting flow, the commenting would continue in a good way, whereas they found out that when they did not do the moderation that they have as their policy, then that things would stop up. People would jump out of the commenting because they just didn't want to be in a section that was coming with those kinds of comments. So is there any kind of explanation that can explain that maybe in some contexts full name policy can have big influence, but in other contexts full name, people on the full name also harass? My gut feeling is that, yeah, you can have people on the full name that do harass too, but you probably get a whole lot less than... Yeah.
Well, there are some research into psychology of online behavior, and I don't have the numbers here, but I think that there is a difference in what kind of context or forum we're speaking about, and I think that a lot of what makes the difference is what they did in NRK, is that actually they are not only moderating the discussions, but they have a presence, like the editors have a presence. And what happens in other online commentary sections, where you don't have a presence from the editors or someone with authority, then things tend to take off. So what we do know is that the lack of resources or the lack of priority in actually being present in those forums is to me, way more important to focus on than should we be anonymous or not. I think presence is extremely important.
Any other questions? Okay, I have 2 questions. You mentioned research and the need for more research. Could you specify a bit, please?
Oh, there's so much.
I know. Prioritize.
Yeah. Well, I think, to me, what is would be interesting to see is what I said about breaking it down, because now we have this idea what happens to male and female debaters online, or we have this ideas of what happened in Norway compared to the US. We have some studies there, we have some studies in Britain, we have some studies in Sweden, but we totally need to compare our data and to see what's context related and what is actually universal. And because the internet is a global place, I think that's really important to see what the local differences are. I also think it's really important to study the technological aspect of it more. And what both Christina and Ramaya talked about, how not only harassment, the online world is seen as a place without social norms, or with not the same kind of social norms that we have in the offline world, and how we can look at that not only in a descriptive way, but also how we can change it. Because I think this kind of research, this line of research needs to be active oriented. It needs to be about collaborating with the police, with journalist organizations, with activists, because we cannot do this alone. So we can provide data, but we need also to be innovative in our ways of finding those data.
Yes, it did. It did.
Answer?
This is not really a question, it's just a comment that I want to make before the debate. Is that what is striking, I think, is that the harassment that happens online is so similar to the harassment that women experience face to face. So really, you can say that arenas are new, the venues are new, but the type of harassment, the very sexualized, very pornographic types of harassment is not new. So I think that also is an interesting aspect in and of itself, that a lot of this is not new. And so we shouldn't be confused, by the debates about technology and online, offline, and all that, because a lot of it is, something that we've lived with for decades.
I think that's true, but I think also that it's really important what several panelists said, that a lot of men, and this is what the journalists that I interviewed told me, that their male colleagues, they trivialize it. They say, I get as much as you. And then when they say, but do you get rape threats? Because they get called an asshole, or like they're stupid, or all this. It's a variety for male as well, but the rape threat is usually what separates the genders here. And I also think that what are finding that this small group of men that gets these speech injuries, that might be a symptom of what he's saying, that they are not, this is not something that they experience in real life. And that's why the shock is so obvious, because it's new. And I think to a lot of people that look at themselves as neutral, it's really shocking to be discriminated against.
Okay, so should we